Next to Mike is Michelle. Michelle Braun is the executive director of Friends of the Winooski River. She has a master's in natural resource planning and has worked nationally on sustainable communities initiatives and locally as a land use planner, playing a key role in home buyouts and floodplain restoration following Tropical Storm Irene. And now again, after the floods of July 2023 and 2024. Friends of the Winooski works with landowners and communities to restore riparian landscapes for all of the many benefits that flow from healthy river corridors and functioning floodplains. Thank you, Michelle, for being here. And last but not least, John Copans is Executive Director of the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience. Previously, he worked at Old Spokes Home, the Vermont Council for Rural Development, the Vermont Public Service Department, the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, and for Congressman Peter Welch. John grew up in Brattleboro, graduated from Macalester College, and lives here in Montpelier with his wife and 3 kids. So thank you, John. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here. I'm going to start with the first question first, which is, can you, and any one of you is free to respond, can you provide a brief overview of river corridor management in Vermont and why it's essential for maintaining the ecological health of our rivers and our watersheds?
I guess I'll start. I have the microphone and then I'll pass it on. River corridors in Vermont was a concept that started probably about 20 years ago. When many of us were engaged in trying our hand at large-scale river restoration work. And we quickly realized, or the river corrected our paper so many times that we began to realize, that we needed to think about restoration at much larger scales than what we had been. And that one of the successes that we did have in our restoration work was the protection of a corridor, giving space to the river. Watching the river use that space to adjust to a slope and a depth of the river that was creating amazing habitat. And so it was from that effort that we set ourselves to designing a river corridor concept in Vermont and creating maps statewide to sort of support the restoration work that was going on.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to add the larger landscape perspective to the river corridor, because as a watershed organization, we work at the geographic scale of the watershed, because we know that the decisions that happen across the landscape beyond the river corridor then have an impact in the river corridor. So to us, it's important to look at the whole scale of the landscape when we're thinking about the benefits to the river corridor.
And maybe I'll add from the local perspective from Montpelier, we're really trying to think about it at both scales. Hyper local in terms of how that river corridor travels through Montpelier and where are there opportunities for us to change the interface of our community with that river corridor such that there's more room for that river, even in a relatively urban setting like Montpelier, but also very much thinking about the watershed as a whole, because you can't really think about these issues as starting or ending at any town line. They really traverse town lines, and we've got to be thinking about the watershed as a whole, and making some hard decisions because we like to build things and we like development, but we have to really make choices about where we are putting things such that we are allowing the river to do what it needs to do. And those are sometimes tough community decisions. And that's one of the roles of the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience, is really trying to make sure our community is making informed decisions about not putting critical things in that floodway where we're then going to have to protect, or we're going to have to restore and recover in a way that ultimately is really expensive for us as a community and doesn't make sense in a long-term way.
I think following on that topic, have you found in your history here in Vermont creative ways to kind of address that tension between wanting to develop and at the same time wanting to conserve those lands? Are there some creative approaches in carrying out those discussions across differences in your communities?
That tension is at the crux of the whole challenge. Most of our river corridors are privately owned. And people who own that land generally have an interest in using that land and or are using it for their home or their business. And, you know, when we were faced with, you know, allowing landowners to continue to channelize their stretch of river to either dredge or berm or armor that river to keep it where it's always been. That was sort of the mentality. We knew that projects like that were perhaps protecting that property for some amount of time, but was most certainly going to affect other property owners and potentially create damage along the rest of the corridor and the ecological effects, et cetera. So one of the creative ways that we approached that was by working very quickly to develop a river corridor easement, which is essentially a buyout of the channel management rights. Most traditional easements, as many of you know, purchase the development rights of a certain area of land. The river corridor easement does that and purchases the channel management rights. Therefore, the holder of that easement then controls to what extent any kind of activity in or along the river would occur, with a general purpose of letting the river remeander and develop again its geometry that is going to be more stable in the long run. And that program has been very popular around the state over the years. You know, there's folks here with the River Conservancy that can tell you to the degree to which they are backlogged with projects. But I know when we had a certain amount of money at the state, it was always oversubscribed. You know, people really wanting to not fight the river because of the expense of it, and learning that their actions might affect other neighbors.
I would say that one of the challenges that we face in working at that point of tension between development and conservation, we work with a lot of great landowners who want to do the right thing, and we are able to help them engage, you know, in learning more about how to take care of their rivers, in learning more about how to take care of the riparian buffer area on their land, in enhancing riparian buffer areas on their land, and that kind of thing. But the way that rivers work is just not intuitive. And the science, our understanding of how they work has been evolving rapidly, would maybe be an overstatement, but it has certainly been evolving over the last couple of decades. And as we better understand what happens when you dig out the channel, it doesn't actually convey more water, or it does, but then there's problems. And, you know, how rivers behave when you act on them isn't always the way you would expect. And so one of the biggest challenges is helping landowners and other people who want to solve problems that we have on the landscape in Vermont, helping them understand what the right actions are to take to solve some of those problems is one of our biggest challenges, and developing, effective communications to help individuals and communities make good choices is a priority for us.
I might say on this question of creativity, well, I'll focus on an example. There's a parcel in Montpelier called 5 Home Farm Way, and we're in the process of restoring that to floodplain. It's right where the Stevens branch comes into the main branch of the Winooski. It's behind the Agway by the roundabout for people who know town a little bit. And the reality is it's really a complicated site. Like, it was owned by a nonprofit that then just sort of evaporated. But yet there are some easements in relation to that. We have to transfer ownership. We have to acquire funds to design. To me, all of that for this one little 12-acre parcel means creativity. Like, you have to come at each parcel with an openness, a problem-solving approach, and a persistence too, because it takes years and years and years to solve the multitude of sort of hurdles that you have to get over in order to actually do the work that we know is essential, which is to restore that to a more natural, I don't know if that's the right term, because we're doing a fair amount of work. I mean, let me see, 1,400 dump truck loads is what we're projecting to remove from that site. Like, all of that sediment to create space for that river. But all of that work takes creativity.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to what extent you've all found that it's so important to have a local champion for those projects, someone that can address the persistence factor that you mentioned, like someone to just push and keep nudging and finding ways to cobble together the funding and overcome the hurdles and the challenges.
I mean, I'll say quickly, it's essential, I think. And here's an observation. We've had a really dynamic conversation in communities around Vermont around a hazard mitigation grant funding round. It's a great opportunity. There's $90 million. There's no local match. And so communities are very enthusiastic. When you engage folks in the Department of Public Works in Montpelier about that opportunity, what they think about first, and it's appropriate and natural, is they think about their own infrastructure and how to protect their own infrastructure. And often, sadly, that's not floodplain restoration. That means, like, I've got a wastewater treatment facility and I got to figure out how I'm going to protect it. And sometimes that means armoring it. In fact, to some degree, exacerbating floodplain issues as opposed to helping them. So often that's a natural role for a public works department in a community. What does that mean? You need other people in that community who are really projecting that broader vision about the need to do this other work around floodplains, around allowing our rivers to have that space. Those people are the catalysts, and ideally they're working year after year after year. These conversations are not a 1 year and done kind of a thing. It really takes persistence over time.
I think we finished a project, a floodplain restoration project along the lines of what John's talking about in Northfield after Irene. We planted the last trees on that site in 2018, so 7 years after the flood. So it does really take hanging in there.
I will agree with the persistence. The Farmway project that John was talking about was one that we were designing almost 15 years ago. And it got turned down at the time, and we walked away from the project. And now here it is. It's got picked back up. There's new voices for it. When we started to try to introduce this new science of applied fluvial geomorphology in the state. We created these hands-on protocols to study maps, to get out in the field and measure the size of rocks. And we hired a core of consultants, professionals that we train on our protocols. And we had one provision for them getting the contract, and that is that they had to bring the local watershed group in to hold the dumb end of the tape, so to speak, out on the river, but be there. I used to hold the dumb end of the tape all the time, but the importance of that couldn't be overstated because I watched, year after year where when we brought that data back out to the public meetings in the towns, we brought the water table to flumes, and there was this presentation by the watershed group or the conservation district of the data that they helped collect. We used to say they own the story of their river now. And to have that local group that knew the story and could speak up for that river and what it is, what it's been through, what we think is going to happen along its course. Well, how can we interact with that? To have a local group of folks that know that, it has been essential to the growth of all of what we're doing, I think.
I have a follow-up question to that, and then I'll open it to the audience. So be thinking about the question that you want to ask. Many of these projects I know involve public-private partnerships. There are conservation groups, as you mentioned. There are government agencies involved, maybe offering technical or financial support, as well as landowners and community members. How do you ensure that all of these efforts are aligned? And what are some of the best practices for fostering that collaboration amongst all those public and private entities in order to accomplish the river protection?
It's another really important question, because if we didn't have VTrans on board with this science, if we didn't have commerce and community development on board with this science, and the list goes on, Natural Resource Conservation Service, Agency of Agriculture, we literally spent years in their offices talking about why geomorphically stable rivers was in the interest of their constituent or their component of the public asset, and integrating the science into their project selection criteria. Getting state policy adopted in the legislature that required all state agencies to be on board with this science and to think about their grant programs. It was very frustrating to talk a community over years into thinking about river corridors, thinking about watersheds, and then have the same community turn around and get a grant from VTrans to build a bike path that channelized the river for 3 miles through their community. And so these perverse incentives were everywhere. And addressing them and engaging your partners and talking about how we can reduce the cost of our transportation network if we are thinking about and managing rivers and river corridors in a certain way. If we conserve our soils, by thinking at a watershed scale about geomorphic stability, how that helps farmers in a valley, etc. But it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of persistence, and you have to follow back all the time.
You also have to go to so many meetings.
Yes.
Many meetings. And people definitely get overwhelmed by the number of, I guess, groups, you might call them, working in this space. and wonder if there's duplication, is there overlap? How are there this many groups? There's the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District, there's Friends of the Mad River, there's the Vermont River Conservancy, there's the Regional Planning Commission, and then there are all the towns. And in some towns, there are little local volunteer groups like the Berry River Access Task Force, for instance, the Cabot Flood Resilience Commission, for instance, John's group in Montpelier. But we really do all have distinct missions. So as long as we're clear about our role and we're communicating with each other, it works really well. We're able to complement each other's strengths. Like Friends of the Winooski, as a grassroots watershed group, we engage a lot of volunteers. So when someone called us and said they had a ton of flood debris on their land, we thought, hey, we have some corporate partners who love to send volunteers for cleanups. So we brought in the volunteers for the cleanup, but then we started talking to the landowner about how valuable their floodplain forest was. And they said, well, we've heard about these river easements. And so we then sent them on to Vermont River Conservancy to talk about river easements. And so then we realized the place on the other side of the river, they needed help, but that was a farm. And so they need to work with folks with access to farm programs. So we connected with the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program folks at the state. So we are always all working together to advance, river corridor health and resilience from many different kind of vantage points. And it, I think, looks messy from the outside. But I think that if anyone, any member of the public comes to one of our organizations, we'll help them find their way to where they are best able to get help.
I might just add or emphasize that there really is a tremendous value in the private partners, in particular folks like the Friends of the Winooski and Vermont Rivers Conservancy. An example of that is another HMGP project in Montpelier is the removal of the dam called the Bailey Dam right below Shaw's. And there will be significant benefit from taking that dam out. That project got developed because of investment from Vermont Rivers Conservancy. When we analyzed the potential benefits to the 5-home farmway project that I just mentioned, turns out there's a real interrelation between that project and another dam called the Pioneer Street Dam. And that's another dam that Vermont Rivers Conservancy is investing in analysis of what the benefits would be of removing that. So just adding to the chorus of those partnerships are really critical. The municipality itself is not in a position, nor does it have sort of the vision to be sort of leading on studying some of these questions. It's hugely helpful to have these private nonprofit entities that have that vision, that have that mission, and can be cultivating and developing, and eventually it moves into the municipal realm because you need to assemble a grant, you need to find match, those sorts of things. But it's really helpful to have those partners out there cultivating and creating the groundwork essentially for these projects.
Awesome. I'll open it up now for questions to the audience. Yeah.
Hi. So we have a good representation from the university. I'm loud here today. I'm curious, the research funding environment's a little bit tricky right now, but pie in the sky research project that is in alignment with your respective missions and money wasn't an issue, what would you do?
Yeah. Right now, I'm working on sort of a third stage of a large project that we started 5 or 6 years ago called Functioning Floodplain Initiative. And this part of the project is to bring the habitat functions into what we call the FFI. And what we are doing because the data that we have throughout the entire Champlain Basin is the connectivity data and some of the floodplain data and the stream power data. And what we're trying to do is draw relationships between connectivity and temperature cover habitat, other types of holding cover habitat that goes with that depth and slope that I talked about, reproductive habitat. And we've just used our best professional judgment to say, here's how the different components of connectivity, vertical, lateral, longitudinal, temporal connectivity in a watershed all should be weighted to help us understand the quality of the physical habitat in stream. And this area is just ripe for, pinning down those relationships, going from our just combined years of experience to say, for cover habitats, or let's say temperature habitats, obviously riparian connectivity is essential. For reproductive habitat, the longitudinal connectivity of a watershed, organisms being able to move up and down the system is essential. Some of them are more obvious than others, but what is the lateral connectivity of a river? Its access to its floodplain and its ability to move laterally and adjust its slope. How does that create specific cover types that are important to the species, aquatic species that we have, both above and below the fall line on Champlain? And I'd love to see researchers pick up on some of those questions and start testing them. It would be fabulous to especially with some of the stream power and hydrology and floodplain data that is there that we used in other parts, the water quality and flood hazard components of the FFI. So I'll just throw that plug out there and hopefully somebody will take an interest.
So what we really need most, I think, is more effective communications. People are really busy. A lot of people, people are caring for kids, people are caring for older parents. People are really, really busy, and people are traumatized from the flooding experiences we've been through the last couple of years and other things. And we really need to figure out, I think a lot of folks in the scientific community feel that the barrier to communication is a lack of scientific literacy on the part of the audience. But I think that the burden is on us to understand how to meet the audience where they are, how to meet our communities where they are, and how to help them understand the choices that they're grappling with. So research on effective communications would be really appreciated. I feel like the whole field of communications is undervalued by some folks, and I'd love to see more investment there.
We, as part of, I keep mentioning the hazard mitigation grant program, the state invested in some work of river engineers, essentially to build a huge project list of prospective projects for a number of communities, including Montpelier. We settled on 5 projects that are getting developed, but there's another 30 potential projects on that list. A question before us as a commission is, which of those projects should we prioritize? Which one goes to the top? Now, it's kind of a complicated decision matrix about which ones you put at the top, but one of the most, obviously the most critical pieces is which of those projects is going to have the greatest benefit in terms of reducing flood elevation in Montpelier? I think the answer to that, we use this term modeling a lot, and I think models exist, and we need to extract the information from those models to help guide these decisions. But that interface between sort of those entities like the commission that are trying to guide the prioritization and sort of the models and the science, I don't think it's always clear and simple how to navigate that and how to extract the guidance that we need. And so to me, that feels like an opportunity of making that interconnection to help guide, whether that's at a municipal scale or you zoom out to a watershed scale. We really should be thinking, just like when we're talking about the TMDL and phosphorus reduction, what projects are going to have the greatest benefit in terms of mitigating flooding. And that's a complicated question because like a benefit to one place is not a benefit to another. But regardless, some ways to interface and translate that data to help guide prioritization.
Great question.
One last thought. Just that folks on Zoom can't see this, but my colleague Erin DeVries from Vermont River Conservancy is in the audience, and Bev Wemple from UVM is in the audience. And we are all going to be learning about what other communities are doing that have been experiencing the kind of flood events that we have. And I'm really excited about that. I think learning about how other places navigate that decision matrix, like what strategies do they have and what structures do they have that help them with that, is going to be really valuable.
Question in the back.
I have a question about the human behavior part of what you all do, and so the Northfield project or other sort of recovery and aftermath pieces is it's going to keep flooding, and so how what's been most effective in your experience in sort of changing our relationship to the rivers and our willingness to adapt or retreat for a long-term abstract threat?
That's a great question. In a little less than an hour, I head to my town, Middlesex, Vermont, where I'm leading a study on how my community might recover from the last 2 years of flooding along the Great Brook. And I've been studying the brook my entire time I've lived in Vermont because I drive it every day. And so I've been aware of the landslide hazards and the vulnerability of people. And now it's real. People's houses are on the brink. And we're wading into this science, trying to understand all of these things about the Great Brook and what it means about our opportunities to restore the brook or to minimize their vulnerability. But many of us are looking at each other and are thinking, oh my God, there's no way that we can intervene on these processes that are happening right now. And how do we help our neighbors, address this issue that they're faced with? And it's heart-wrenching. I don't really know personally, if I get asked that question in an hour, what I'm going to say. We have to arm ourselves with as much information, use the modeling, understand the benefit costs of this, that, and the other. But in the end, it's going to be really hard decisions that are going to affect people's very life savings or whatever. Hopefully not their safety. But, the way our programs are set up right now, many of our communities are not really even eligible for some of the, the buyout opportunities that are there at the federal level. None of these residents along Great Brook and Middlesex are eligible. They're not in a special flood hazard area. They're in a landslide zone. And so, I'm hopeful that as we as scientists and social and technical sciences all continue to look at these situations and try to learn how to prioritize and use the models and get the data that we create an imperative, really, to try to change the way we support communities and support homeowners. It's tragic that, in many ways that we support people moving into some of these places. And now we're trying to get them out. Whether it's through our mortgage practices or our insurance practices or what have you. There's all these institutional barriers to being able to really help our neighbors the way they need to be helped. And so, again, there's no quick answer to that question, but I think we have to continue to do this work all over Vermont that it's so urgent for us to hopefully, be able to get to the table with some of our federal partners and state partners and change the way we direct resources to help communities in some of these dangerous river corridors.
My short answer for Nathan is what I have seen in my experience in the last 15 years is that what it takes is being flooded twice in quick succession. That'll do it. Otherwise, if folks just get flooded once, they can recover. In a trauma response, you want to put things back the way they were, right? And that's recovery, putting it back the way it was. If they get flooded, if they just go through that once and they put everything back the way it was, they can be okay for 10 years and put it behind them. If it happens twice in quick succession, that's when you see folks, and both at the individual level and the community level, that's when people start thinking differently, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we've had the opportunity to observe that.
Yeah. Question.
In quick succession, we had that what wasn't as bad as the first, and it was reassuring to a lot of people. Then for communication to the public, I was surprised about the term stability of the river stability geomorphic stable. What do you mean by stable geomorphic? That, for those of us who are not part of that, it sounds like the wrong idea. So just
yeah, no, it's a good question. Have it, and that when we first started to talk about geomorphic process in the state, we were still in the hard rock era. You just armored everything, and so we were entering that conversation using geomorphic stability. I mean, we quickly tried to define it as processes that basically maintain the vertical profile of the river, which should allow us to minimize.
I wasn't asking for an explanation. I was just pointing out that you're trying to convey the idea.
Yes.
Oh, that's not.
So noted.
My real question
Yeah.
is, most of what I hear about, Michelle's asking about this, we're mostly talking about work on the rivers. But what that work isn't going to get done for years, and the example of the 5-acre project is a good example of that. 15 years after it was brought up, now we're starting. But anyway, it's going to take too long. So what are we doing about the water in the hills before it gets to the river?
Well, that's the whole hydrology of the watershed and efforts to conserve headwaters areas is becoming increasingly high priority for our conservation organizations. Working across multiple conservation organizations to do very large headwater protection projects. I know, going back to the project I just mentioned in Middlesex, I sit on I joined the local roads committee to work on this Great Brook project. And we talk about turnouts. We talk about ways to slow and spread the water. We've ditchified our town. And
We have those, the acceptable
Yeah.
management practices.
Yeah.
But apparently they're not really done as much as they should.
unless you have the two floods.
Are we seeing anything?
I can't tell you how, almost every road in our town was put back together and it used those practices. We put in the right,
But how about the logging roads?
a good question, especially the legacy logging. There's certainly state water quality money that's been directed towards forests and parks to try to address some of that. It's not enough. But yeah, this temporal connectivity, this watershed hydrology, and how we've altered it is a big part of that instability, right? We do need to pay attention to that as much as, all the other pieces.
One thing to clarify a little bit, maybe this is so unhelpful, but our watershed organizations came about because we wanted to help with the ecological health of the rivers, right? For all of the water quality and wildlife habitat, ensure healthy food webs so that we have insects, so that fish and birds can eat insects and mammals can eat the fish and birds and so forth. And a lot of the funding that we have access to is connected to those goals, water quality and habitat goals, ecosystem health goals, not flood resilience goals. It happens that a lot of the activities that we do in pursuit of water quality and habitat improvement have flood resilience benefits. So like when we plant trees in order to filter stormwater and make the river cleaner and shade the water so it's cooler for the fish, that also has a flood resilience benefit. But the funding that we have to do that is not for flood resilience. And a lot of flood resilience activities are geared toward preventing damage to existing settlements, preventing homes from flooding, preventing businesses from flooding, which is not really our mission as much as we care about our neighbors and our community, downtown infrastructure and that kind of thing. That's not where our funding comes from. It's not our mission exactly. So this is where we get into some weird situations with flood resilience, because we recognize the benefit of working in the headwaters and working in forests and ensuring flood resilient forests. We did a project after Irene in the headwaters, Cabot, Marshfield, and Plainfield, to work on flood resilient forestry practices in those communities. That project started in 2018, following after Irene. It followed way after Irene. But then by 2021, folks were saying, everybody's bored of flooding. Can we talk about emerald ash borer? We don't want to talk about flooding anymore. And that was like the one time that we actually had funding to work explicitly on flood resilience, and people tuned out kind of. But we don't have that much access to funding to address specifically flood resilience. So it's a weird, flood resilience is a weird space because there's this FEMA hazard mitigation money that's meant to reduce future insurance outlays. It's meant to reduce the cost of insurance, essentially. And that's the main funding that we have specifically to do flood resilience. So I think we are all looking at different resilience investment strategies. The Vermont Treasurer, Mike Pichak, is leading an effort to identify new resilience investment strategies or creative resilience investment strategies. But the whole funding structure for flood resilience is a little wonky right now.
I'll just piggyback on what Michelle was describing. That I would say we see it also as a governance question, which is there is not sort of there is an infrastructure that has evolved over time around phosphorus, around the TMDL, and that sort of lives within ANR and DEC, and then has some partner organizations. Similarly, I don't think there is the same thing for flood resilience. So in fact, for the Montpelier Commission, one of the things that we have initiated, we had what we called the Winooski Flood Resilience Roundtable, took place a couple of months ago in just 2 buildings down from here. And we had 25 municipalities, literally from the headwaters, from Cabot, all the way down to like Colchester, Essex, Shelburne, all municipalities in a room together. And much of that, I don't want to sort of oversell what that was, because I don't know that we walked out of that room with any accomplishments, other than it's very clear right now that if you're a municipal select board member, town administrator, road foreman, right now, chances are pretty good that you're having to answer questions around flood resilience, because your community pretty much almost universally across the watershed is experiencing it. And so when we, as elected officials, when they are fielding those questions, it compels them to act. And we are creating a venue for them and for us to come together and to say, okay, this is not something that we're going to solve individually as communities. How do we work as a watershed to address this question of flood resilience? What kind of mechanism? Some of it's a financing question of what are the dollar sources to get these projects done, but a lot of it's also really a capacity question and a capacity mismatch, which is most of the land where this matters are in very rural communities where they literally have a half-time, town clerk. Maybe they have, if they're lucky, they have a town administrator. They have a 3-member volunteer select board. They literally, when you sort of look to them and say, gosh, we want you to do X, we want you to apply for X funding source to get the following project done, they're going to be like, I just don't have the resources to do that. So what our goal is to build this collaborative across the watershed to really start to solve those problems of how we actually share some common vision, some sense of common direction, but build the mechanisms for cross-border, cross-town line collaboration to really start to get some things done.
Awesome. I'm going to come back to you because we do have one online comment. Hopefully it'll be short and we'll come right back to you.
We have about 30 people in the Zoom room and not many questions, but one came up when you were talking about habitat earlier. Like, it's a question about Japanese knotweed and calendula. And just could you talk broadly about how much of a problem is knotweed, both for connectivity and flooding, or just invasive plant species in general?
You got me with that question again. I don't drive up the Mad River Valley because it makes me cry. No, Japanese knotweed is a pervasive, invasive plant that is dominating many of our riparian areas. And, there's been some valiant efforts on part of watershed groups to try to deal with pieces of it here and there. I think I read recently that there are some research into some controls that we all cross our fingers about. Short of that, I'm not very optimistic that we are going to get ahead of the problem unless we find a way to, support either hopefully a biological control that doesn't cause other harms, which is we've had issues with in our past for sure. It is a big impact to our riparian and aquatic habitat.
Question.
Okay, Don, you were thinking what I going to ask. every level, from local town, villages, to nonprofits, to the state. There is a capacity issue. There are very few people, as you mentioned, working across those scales to implement some of these practices that we've been talking about today. And so I'm just wondering if you've come across any novel ways, like co-sharing a position, or technical assistance that's being shared across watersheds, across regional planning commissions, that sort of thing. And I guess I have another piece that was about workforce development in the state. The governor, there's other people in the state that are looking at growing our population, which everyone has different opinions about that, for sure. And I'll just share that, like, I'm in support of that if it's in a sustainable way, right? To grow, bring people here. How can we bring people to Vermont that are smart, that are interested in living here and working on some of these big, large scale practices that we're trying to put into place? We need to build our workforce capacity, and I'm just wondering if any of you have heard ways in which we could do that at the level.
I'm going to take a crack at the first part of your question, and I've already referenced it, but when the state announced this big piece of HMGP funding, what they did is they initiated something called the River Program, and the River Program was put together with the Regional Planning Commission as sort of the anchor, but then also hiring these private engineering firms. And I will say that the work that they did, it was SLR Consulting, Roy Schiff here in Montpelier. They took an enormous burden off of the municipality's sort of to-do list by really developing, sort of growing the list and then sorting that list with relatively, they were not doing a deep dive into each project. But to me, that model where the state sees a need and knows that in no way is each municipality going to be able to develop their own set of projects and makes a strategic investment through the RPC in that kind of capacity. Again, Roy did the same work for Berlin and for Barrie. And so to me, that's a direction that should be replicated, is the state seeing that need and figuring out a way to bring in the expertise to do some of that work.
We have just about 1 minute left.
I would just say that at the convening John mentioned earlier, towns were definitely expressing interest in shared positions. And certainly in the headwaters communities, I think they were pretty serious about it. We'll see where that goes.
I'll just say thank you and for all of you for coming. And my 2 cents on that is that we do need that set of private consulting or services at the watershed scale. I know of a handful of consultants that pop into my mind every time I think about one of these projects. Mentioned Roy, Kristen, Evan. I mean, there's a small group. We need that group in every county that's supporting municipalities, and it's going to take probably a jump start from the state to make that happen.
Great question. We are out of time because, and we don't want to go over because Mike has another commitment at 5. So if we can give another round of applause to all 3 of our speakers. There are snacks, as you know, in the back, and we can congregate and maybe ask a few more questions of our other than Mike, of our guests.
Yes. Sorry,
Thanks.
folks.
Yeah, good luck.
Yeah.
Holy moly. So much, Mike. Did you get